We enter what is known in event planning as the dreaded pre-lunch slot. It's often when you get an audience dip, they're tired, they've had a lot on, yeah, they had the break, but they're looking for lunch, etc. So when you're planning this, you've got to bring in somebody who is a powerhouse speaker, right? And the topic has to be so gripping that you're going to hold everybody so that when you decant them for lunch, they go off and have an amazing chat. So the challenge is being met on this stage now by Indy Johar. He's an architect by training, but his studio is called Dark Matter Labs, in reference to the often invisible systems and structures that he believes underpins our world and have to be redesigned in order to unleash a new set of products and places that can regenerate our planet. Be prepared to be taken on a journey through macro political trends and narratives, through growing new regenerative markets and next generation value, and a greater role for design as polymathic and working at a planetary scale. Please join me in welcoming Indy to the stage.
Good morning, or good afternoon, actually. I'm delighted and honored to be here, and I know I'm between you and lunch, so I've got a tough act here. But I'm going to quickly take you through a bit of a journey that I think is really critical for us to think about. We're at I think, a really critical point of design and how we design the future. And I think we have to look the future in the eye in a much more realistic way. A little bit about DM, I won't do. Dark Matter Labs, we're a not-for-profit public interest organization. We're about 75 people around the world. Lots of different capabilities, not just designers. And we're trying to create a new type of institutional framework to be able to build new types of organisms that are necessary. But what does this decade of deep transition mean in the world, and what do we mean to design in that? Well, firstly, in a really no bullshit way, we're going to have to be thinking about designing in a 3 degrees warmer world. Pretty much everything that's telling us is we're looking at 3 degrees to maybe 2.8 to 3.4 degrees temperature rise in current frameworks. That's without any of the big tipping points being hit. So what does that mean? That's what it means. 3 degrees global average, 5 degrees on land, 8 degrees in urban environments. Average. That's global average, right? Now, just to put this in context, at about 1.7 to 1.9 degrees temperature rise, we lose one of the major food baskets in the world. There are 5 major food baskets. So 3 degrees, at 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, you lose one of the major food baskets. In 2008, you may remember there were fires outside Moscow, which resulted in peatlands being burnt and no fertilizer being shipped around the world. So food prices shot up. And there were riots in 60 cities around the world, including actually what happened in the Middle East. Food prices, social destabilization. And so what are we talking about? Well, places like Madrid being 8.5 degrees warmer at night. What does that mean? Domestic violence goes up. Crime goes up. It means transformers fail more early. Maintenance costs go up. Heat stroke, number of errors, unforced fatal errors go up in a system. The cascading effects are numerous when we start to look into this future. So part of the thing that you then start to think about, what happens in the UK? Well, we live in a slightly weird context that we can get warmer and we could get significantly cooler depending on the AMOC current. Right? So we are heated by the North Atlantic, a current in the North Atlantic. So that means when you're talking about retrofitting cities, what you have to start to think about is the resilience to be able to get warmer and cooler. Often I sit in rooms and people were still talking about energy retrofit from the point of heat, totally discounting actually the coolth and the cooling load that the UK is going to almost certainly need, and what a major heat load that it could turn into. So how do we start to think about this future? And what does this mean to around the world? Well, it becomes even more dangerous. So all the red are spaces which move outside the habitable zone, human niche habitable zones. And that means they become, that's by 2070. And you're already seeing some of these effects. You don't have to wait for these effects. What happens is you're already seeing in Europe a depopulation of Europe, southern Europe to northern Europe. Migrations are going on already in that environment. At the same time, actually we have a systemic resilience gap. Our financing of resilience in the face of a three-degree world, and 3 degrees is not just about 3 degrees temperature rise, right? It's about water, wind, flooding, all the energetics of a system changing. So we've got very little money moving towards resilience, adaptation of our cities to fundamentally a different climate. That's if it stabilizes. So this is why the word to use is climate breakdown. We're losing predictable weather, and as a result of the loss of predictable weather, we will be going into an instability period. And this breakdown, I would argue to you, is a symptom. Because it's not just about temperature, right? It's about mental health, it's about bridges, roads. UK railways that are designed, the rails are designed for about 39 degrees temperature top, after which they start to buckle. The whole rail network, the actual rails are designed for a particular, because they were designed in a particular environment. And as you start to lose that environment, you lose the predictability of your logistics. You lose the predictability of your logistics, you get price. So hyper price, so what we saw in COVID, where you'll get volatility of prices. And inequality starts to increase. Now, I'm saying that we're pretty much laid down on the road to that reality right now. And it's also worth recognizing that when we talk about this stuff, carbon is just a symptom, right? Carbon is a symptom of a much more structural problem, whether it's microplastics in your bloodstreams or whether it's other forms of violence and ecological destruction that we're doing, because our economic model is rooted in externalization and extractionism. The externalization is carbon, and that carbon is now feedbacking into us through the climate breakdown effects. So we have a more fundamental problem at the root design of this. This is why I don't believe many enterprises that sit there and say, oh, we're going to solve this, because 68% of enterprises, right, if you were to price in social environmental costs, are non-viable. So our current economic model is only viable in the externalization of those realities. So let me give you an example. My shirt. My shirt is a 45-pound shirt. I do not wear expensive shirts. If you were to price in fully social environmental costs into that, guess how much? Closer to 250 to 450 pounds. So our collective middle class lives are a function of externalization and extractionism. They're non-viable if you want to preserve any form of longitudinal future. Now, imagine designing in that world. What does your shirt and garment really look like? What does your house really look like? What's the true cost of a house? What's the economic models of a house? How do you think? So if you talk to Professor John Schnellhuber, who does a lot of work on carbon, he would say that if you are building a timber house, you need the timber to sequester that carbon for 500 years. So what is the material economy of design and architecture when you have the responsibility, not just the right, but the responsibility to sequester that carbon over that period? And our food systems. How many people here are vegan? Come on, hands up. Thank you. I appreciate it. That food system, have a look at it. When people talk about the Anthropocene, that's what they mean. Wild animals are a little bubble on the world which is largely a farm. So the Anthropocene is literally the world as a farm. This future is pretty much unviable for us for lots of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is, yes, the carbon impact, but second is the ecological impacts, and third is fundamentally we're going to need the biomasses for other goods. And our current population base can't carry on supporting this. We have a net loss of agricultural land, our nutrition cycles are declining, our soil quality is declining. That will drive fundamentally a shift in our nutrition. What does human nutrition look like over the next 25 years? Completely different. So as designers, open landscape. This will change. How we govern our places, our soils will change. So we're going to have to talk about agroforestry. We're going to have to talk about governance more like terra preta, like how the Amazon was an open garden cultivated by people living there. It was not farmed in the traditional manner. It will talk about precision machinery that is able to do precision farming in radical new ways. Our whole theory of the wild and the cultivated will be rewritten. So you want to design? Great place to design. And it also means stuff like glaciers. So work that we've done in, for example, looking at critical glaciers around the world. What you realize is many of the glaciers by 2070 and most of the Alps, the glaciers in the Alps will disappear. Right? They'll be gone. Implication, stable water supply across Europe. Implication, agriculture. Where is sustainable agriculture without a sustainable water supply? So the projects of the 21st era are actually looking at how do you preserve the glaciers? How do you stabilize the glaciers? Yesterday I wrote a piece on Substack. Future is not about geoengineering, it's geogardening. You're going to have to think at a scale of landscape and have to garden those environments and stabilize them in radical ways. Those are the projects of the 21st century that are coming at us. And it's not straightforward, right? So I often use this diagram because everyone goes, oh, look at solar. Yes, solar's great. But if what you look at up there, what you see is we're fundamentally a civilization born of hydrocarbon energy. So in 1800, that was the basis of our energy. And we have to pivot that energy basis to a fundamentally different demand. At the same time, what we're having to do is change our energy sources to electrify them. We don't have the copper mines right now in process for the amount of copper that we need. There is enough copper, but we don't have the copper mines in play to be able to extract that copper. And at the same time, we're having a massive increase in energy demand. Since 2021, the US energy demand has started to rise again. Data centers, yes, by reshoring industry. So what is our energy future starting to look like is going to be a fundamental design question. And we're going to see massive energy inequality. And energy inequality also means compute inequality. It also means not just compute inequality, who has access to AI and AI compute generative. This is a one-to-one linkage. Civilizations that are able to go from energy to compute to AI's assistance will have a different advantage. Civilizations which are energy poor, water poor, will struggle into that reality. And that resource war is already in play. But it's not straightforward. As we move from hydrocarbons to a mineral economy, that's the scale of transformation we're talking about. So if you want to talk about landscape design, that's what we're talking about. A vast increase in our mineral extraction. Vast increase. At the same time, if you look at it relative to our coal infrastructure, right, it's massively small. So the amount of coal mining we're doing is huge relative to mineral mining. However, the caveat, copper. A copper ore used to be 40% copper in the 1920s. Now it is 0.4%. So we're having to multiply nearly 100 times more. We have to mine 100 times more to get the same amount of copper. So don't just look at the pure numbers, look at the total gross numbers. And the environmental damage. We know our ecological systems are systemically over-farmed, and we're destroying the ecological systems. And it's also very clear that actually we need those ecological systems for our own health, right? If you look at it, I think there's some research done, if you take what's the guy that, Gosh, the word's gone out of my mind. You're the guys in space in suits, what they call astronauts. That's it. The guys in space and astronauts. So if you take an astronaut, the kind of idea is that if you put an astronaut in space and you isolate them, without the microbiome of the planet, actually their intelligence declines. So our intelligence is fundamentally rooted with the microbiomes of our environment. The top 5 neighborhoods in the world share very similar microbiomes. So we are not a divisible species in the classical format. How we, Le Corbusier designed us to be individuated and separated. It's not our reality. It's not biological reality. So when we have to start to think like that, we have to start to think fundamentally differently. At the same time, volatility, social contract breaking. Right? This is what we've been seeing. Healthy foods, nutritionally rich foods in the UK have gone up 82% in the last 4 years. Don't just look at food costs, look at nutritious food costs and what that delta is looking like. How do you reimagine that becomes significant. So, as we operate into this future, I'm running against the clock and your lunch, is how do we operate in a carbon-constrained future? How many homes do you think the UK can afford to build if we were to live by the Paris Accord? It's about 14,000 homes. Not 1.5 million, as the government loves to talk about. But government's talking about multiple years, but literally you can build 14,000 homes. That's the carbon budget we have available. How do you operate in that constraint? That's excluding retrofit, by the way. Right? So everyone says retrofit. It's excluding retrofit. That's what we have available. How do you operate in that reality? And everyone just ignores it, but remember, ignoring that carbon budget gets us to those 3-degree, 4-degree futures. You ignore that carbon budget, gets us to those futures, and that also means that you're actively operating in the genocide of the future. Right? This is not a casual trade. So when we start to operate in this reality, what does it start to look like? You start to realize the numbers are nowhere close. This is Denmark. Denmark has gone from 9.6 kilograms of carbon CO2 emissions per square meter to 7.1. That was a big policy move. It's a market leader. Needs to be at 0.4 by 29. There is no viable housing industry in that reality, in the way we currently have it. And that is an opportunity for you as designers. How do you design into that reality? My plea to all of you is don't design in the illusion of the present, design in the reality that's emerging. That is your core value function, right? The present is already dead, it's a zombie. It's giving you lies, it's already dead, it just doesn't know it yet. But the future is demanding a different reality. And this goes all the way down. You can see what this starts to mean when you start to get through the numbers, to change typologies. Do we need buildings to keep us warm, or are we going to use clothes? We're going to have to change our material comfort levels of buildings. We're going to have to radically think about this stuff in much more serious ways. And just to give you the kind of numbers where you need to get to, even rammed earth walls, only if you include or exclude all the equipment required for them, get you anywhere close to the numbers. Just the scale of what we're talking about. This is one of the best retrofits that have been done. And what you realize is it's got a 21-year payback period after which it becomes net zero. We no longer have 21 years. That's the problem, right? If we'd done this in 2001, we could have been sitting here happy as Larry, we'd been all right. But we haven't. Now we don't have the carbon budget left. So retrofit, high material retrofit just isn't available to us because the embodied carbon is too large. So what I'm trying to get to is that the future is fundamentally challenged in every landscape, whether it's energy, water, materials, and what it means to be human, right? Are humans units of labor, or are humans going to be something more? In an age of rapid robotification, which is what we are going to see, we're going to see a fundamental transformation of what it means to be human. That whole stack is fundamentally being reimagined. That will change how we exist, then change the nature of the materials that we consume, and the nature of the lives we lead. Will I be buying £450 shirts? Unlikely. So will I buy 1 shirt, 3 shirts? Will I borrow shirts? Whole new economy of materiality. whole new economy of materiality. And that's just shirts. I can go through the whole thing. Now, I'm going to be close on time. Okay. So what this also means is we have to create new demand for the future. I think one of the key roles of designers is not just the provision of supply for the existing production industry and the existing legacy production industries. It is your capacity to construct the desire of a new future. Desire manufacturing is going to be a key role for design, because existing supply industries are trapped into legacy pathways and legacy liability costs. They cannot move. Designers are going to have to become more entrepreneurial and construct new desire and new demand, and that will be a key value function. And that, I think, is a key contribution we can make when we start to talk about the scale of change that we're talking about. So as we start to look into this, this also means the nature of our solutions have to be fundamentally different. Now let's talk about, so I'm going to use language, which I think is what the part of the problem is. I'm designing a house. Am I designing a house, or am I designing the store of timber, an energy production agent, a cohabitation with ecological systems? Am I designing a water purification system? Am I designing an air quality system? Am I designing an environment? It's no longer a house. It's multi-solving multiple things. Am I restabilizing the soil? So we have to start to think about the nature of design, not through form follows function or forms follow capital, which is more coherent, but form has to fundamentally become a multi-solving issue. We have to multi-solve with every intervention, and that requires us to engage in fundamentally different ways. And this requires us to actually also think about the future in how do we make resilience, how do you make transitions, and how do you make absolute deep forms of transformation? And what are the pathways of doing that in an integrated way at neighborhood levels and other frameworks? This requires us to think about radical solutions. So we're working on universal basic nutrition. What does universal basic nutrition look like in a city? How would you provide it? How would you care for it? So you start to imagine radical new futures that are currently available. And what I find fascinating is there are people starting to not only talk with us about it, but actually willing to invest and think about this in meaningful ways in an age of insecurity. This is a piece of work done by Alex Novak, a colleague of mine, on actually looking at food systems and experience of food systems over the next 10 years in terms of food inequality and what that will do. And so there are really beautiful and interesting and clever and dangerous questions that we need to start to engage with. We need to start to think about our environment in radically different ways. Trees, 97% of trees are male trees. Do you know that? Because they're typically low maintenance, not necessarily men, but male trees are. But by implication, that's because what they do, as you got nicer, they produce high levels of pollen, so that's why we've got vast amounts of asthma. So we plant lots of trees, low maintenance, high amounts of pollen, high amounts of urban asthma, right? That's because we're optimizing for the maintenance costs, not the healthcare costs. So we're going to have to start to think of budgets and finances in fundamentally integrated ways that recognize that value in a systemic nature. And there's multiple other forms of values, again, the work that we've been doing around Trees AI. And we're going to have to think about designing at what I would say is a population level. I think we're moving from object and services to infrastructure scale thinking. And how do you start to think about the value of infrastructure scale thinking? So this is some piece of work we did around the High Line. If you price the High Line, right, if you looked at the land value uplift of the High Line, it would have generated something in the region of 3.48 billion in land value uplift. It cost 78 million to build. So the spillover value of common goods is vast. And the economics of common goods is going to be the key generator of the future, not private goods. So how do you invest in rebuilding common goods? Whether it's tree canopies of cities or whether it's other forms, becomes a key part of that future. How do you construct social agreements? I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that how do you organize 1,000 people to come to agreement to do something? This is a really important challenge, and technology is opening up pathways of organizing, not at the scale of, oh, let's have a little workshop, or let's get 150 together in a hall. How do you organize 1,000 people, 10,000 people, and organize commitment in radical new ways? So even the nature of participation in the construction of these realities is going to fundamentally change and is necessary to change. So also this is rooted, I would argue, in a different way of being with the world, right? I think what we're seeing is a default, a move away from dominion, control, property dynamics into a different way of being. And as we look into that, that also requires us to transform our relationships. So we're doing a lot of work around houses which own themselves, land which owns themselves. You start to talk about explosion of sovereignty, explosion of agency in the world. And how do you organize in an explosion of sovereignty and agency is a fundamentally different worldview. So you move away from a dominion-led model of control to an explosion of sovereignty. So we move to a communion of subjects operating together. It's a fundamentally different way of governing and organizing together. So I'm going to end here that I think it's a very stark reality that we're facing. And in that stark reality, everything is going to have to change. And as designers, I think we have to design fundamentally differently into a different world. And one of our challenges is to break away from the legacy institutions and languages that we've been taught into, to actually embrace what is a really incredible world that is waiting to be built. And as designers, it requires us to not be the post-it workshop manufacturers, but actually start to synthesize the world. Work at the intersection of economics, computation, work at the intersection of behavioral design. And I think it requires new competencies from us beyond the visuals and the communication skills that we break. I do think there's a radical future of design available and necessary. And so that's why I'm really humbled to be here with you all and to be part of the World Design Congress, because I think there's a really important move, and I really welcome you into it. Thank you.
Short and sweet. It's lunchtime. I don't want to see you until 4, unless you're here at 2 for a Hive session. Please go enjoy your lunch. Bon appétit. We'll be back in the afternoon. Enjoy. Thank you.